First item I'd like to go through is getting an early start on a budget outlook for fiscal year 2020. And I have with me today Mr. Agostini, Mr. Stevenson from the Department of Management and Finance, and Tyler Smith on the computer over there. I wanted to give you an early preview of where we think the budget conversation will be going as we start it now, and which will conclude with my presentation of a budget to you in February of 2019. So let's go to the first slide, and you'll see here, okay, you see here, wanted to highlight essentially on the left side, you see a graph that talks about real estate revenue growth and the history of it going back to calendar year 1999. And you'll see, and it's noted in the text box, that essentially since about calendar year 17, 18, so, and this is for, over the last 3 or 4 years, growth rates for real estate revenue have leveled off around 2 to 3%. And you'll also notice something else, which is that in previous years, when one part of the real estate sector, like commercial, was doing well, that would act as a backstop for residential, which was doing poorly, and vice versa. If residential, if commercial was doing poorly, residential would kick up. You'll see right now that it's essentially, that's not happening. You have them both sort of working at pretty much the same level. So we've talked a lot about how having a 50-50 split in our real estate tax base really helps us through some of these peaks and valleys. That is not what's been happening over the last 3 or 4 years. And as noted on the bottom of the slide, on the left, you'll see that real estate taxes provide close to 60% of the county's tax revenue, or its total revenue. Right, so on the right, as far as other sources of taxes, which include personal property and our business, professional, and occupational license tax and other taxes, you can see that growth rates actually have stepped down from where they were in fiscal year 17 to a lower level below 3%, and the forecast through 21 is that they'll actually stay at that low level. So going to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the forecast and some of the discussions we'll have about expenditure growth. You can see here a couple of lines that we've graphed related to expenditure growth, one for Metro, and I think you'll all remember in fiscal year 18, that really was an aberration because we had to step up and provide an extra chunk of money prior to reaching the regional agreement. And we have, as part of the agreement on the operating side, essentially a cap, and I'll talk a little bit more about about the wage increases associated with that, but a 3% annual increase in the operating subsidy. And you can see that as far as paying off our debt, which we have a limit that it'd be 10% of our annual operating budget, but you can see that by percentages, that continues to grow year over year, somewhere in the vicinity of 6 to 7%. And then we also have had, and this board has made a commitment, and I've made a commitment to continuing to invest in our workforce for competitive pay. We're almost in a full employment economy. It's been very difficult for us. Witness the conversation we had in the spring about recruitment for public safety, fire, and police. Wanted to go to the next slide, which talks about essentially what does this all mean for fiscal year 2020. And I'm providing a range of what I consider right now to be the gap between our estimated expenses and estimated revenues. So very clearly, I do not anticipate at this point that our revenue picture will change measurably between now and the end of the year. We need to do our due diligence on that. There may be some small adjustments. The range is actually a component of what elements you include in expenditures. So walking through this, you'll see at the very top, if you focus just at what I call base expenditure growth, which is essentially carrying through on the current mix of programs we have without adding anything new, we have about a 3% growth, and that exceeds the revenue growth by about twice, and that creates about around $9 million towards that $20 to $35 million gap. And then I'll let you all add up the other pieces which make up the balance of it that get you up to $35 million. And I will talk a little bit about how some of those other pressures, for example, in affordable housing and state of good repair, and some of those items there are a little bit different from each other about whether they're going to be ongoing costs or one-time costs. In very small print, in honor of Mr. Chadwick, who is here, you'll see that this does not include APS funding needs, which are currently estimated at a gap between expenses and revenues at $43 million. And it doesn't talk about the additional Metro subsidy that might be occasioned by some of the wage issues that Mr. Dorsey referenced in his presentation. So just to remind everybody where we were in fiscal 19, where this board decided to land when it came to issues surrounding the budget, we faced, when I proposed the budget, a gap of about $20.5 million. And this is what the board did in adoption in April to close that gap. There were three components, and as you can see, about $8.5 million in spending reductions in programs, $5.5 million in funding realignments. That was really moving some costs off of the general fund to other fund sources. And then the utility tax was increased in April, and then we had the user fee increases, the main one being the increase in parking meter rates. So you can see those three components, when added up, got us to the $20.5 million gap. Now let's fast forward to where we are for fiscal 20. We have the same graphic, and you can see that at a minimum, we're going to have a $20 million issue, somewhere between $20 and $35 million. And so what my point here is that as we face the issue this year as opposed to last year, we have lost some of the flexibility we had last year about making some, I don't even want to call them easy, but some of the decisions we made last year, those levers we have, will be more difficult to use in this case. We're looking at potentially greater impacts on programs and services. I'd say that at this point, I think it would be reasonable to consider a potential increase in tax rates. And the ability to do those funding realignments and efficiencies certainly is there, but it's to a much more limited extent. So I think when we don't know where we're going to end up in February when we propose the budget, but when the board adopts in April, I suspect that there'll be a graphic like this that we prepare that will have a lot more in the spending reduction bucket than it did last year. Just a reminder to everyone who's listening what the county's current real estate tax rate is. It's 0.993, and that's per $100 in assessed value, and you can see how that compares with neighboring jurisdictions. And also a reminder, because we are asked this all the time, what was an increase in a penny on the tax rate? And that yields about $7.6 million in revenue, and that's overall, without even accounting for a share of that going over to Arlington Public Schools, and that for the average taxpayer, a penny increase comes to approximately $63 on the average tax bill. So some of the things that we will be thinking through over the next months is how to handle what we will bring to the board in October for advertisement and essentially adoption in November, our closeout recommendations, which is that the prior year fund balance in the past has provided a ever-reducing cushion for dealing with non-recurring budget issues. Based on the information I've received to date, the closeout amounts available for this board to consider in October and November will actually be higher than they have been over the last few years. And that is an artifact of steps that county department heads made to hold off on hiring, anticipating some of the reductions that were going to take place in fiscal year 19. So that will provide us some flexibility. And we've mentioned this in the past, but it's a point you'll hear from me many times and from Mr. Agostini and Mr. Stevenson if they ever get you cornered in an alley, run, because they will talk about county reserves and how the rating agencies have made the point that we currently have a 5% reserve of for our general fund, and that compares with our comparator AAA jurisdictions, which most of them are at 10%. There's been very explicit statements made by Moody's and allusions by the other rating agencies that the county needs to do more in that area to increase their reserves. We will see what I propose on that, but usually in the past when we've increased our reserves, we have used this one-time funding that's available in closeout. And that's an increase that is shared both by the county and schools. So if we increase it, the schools would have to contribute a like amount. And then I have down the last bullet, I call an unofficial hiring slowdown. And actually, I don't know whether it's unofficial, official, but it's actually something that's in process. I've had conversations with department heads that as vacancies occur, we are asking department heads to use their best judgment and filling them, and I've essentially said approximately 3/4 of the vacancies should go remain unfilled. Department heads will have a chance to determine which ones are a priority need for them. And I specifically told our police chief and our acting fire chief to not hold off on any hiring, to proceed with hiring in both of those areas consistent with the direction we received from the board, and I think the importance of that. So I wanted to, without sort of making too big a point about it, I will be reporting back to the board on a regular basis as to what impacts you may see in fiscal year 19, that's starting now, in a potential degradation of services where we are not filling vacancies and the staff that the board anticipated and the community anticipated would be available to carry out programs. We may not have as much of that staff on hand as we had anticipated at the beginning of the year, and so it may take longer for us to provide certain services to people, and I want them to be mindful of that. That's really, in my experience, the best way to provide flexibility for this board and for me in proposing a budget is to not go out and hire people that you simply are going to have to turn around and potentially let go 5 or 6 months later. It's not a good practice, and there's a challenge in there determining what is critical, and there's some level of discretion there. So I'll be having conversations with the board about that and updating the community. So let's go to the last slide, which is the timeline. We don't even have September on the timeline, so that's how special this is. We're starting with this I call first briefing. I'm going to be hosting a virtual town hall on October 17th. We did one for the capital improvement plan. It worked very well, where I stand in a room with about 10 people and thousands of people are watching online as we live stream it, and we get hundreds of questions in, and we answer those. As I noted, we'll come to the board in October with an advertisement on our closeout funding proposal, and the board would consider that for adoption. And then it's at the board's discretion at some point in October or November to provide guidance to me and to further set expectations for the county workforce and the community. And as you know, as I noted, February, which will be here soon enough, we'll have a proposed budget presentation followed by a series of public hearings and a very extensive public engagement process. So that, I wanted to pause on that to see if the board had any questions on that, because I ran through a lot of material.
Mr. Manager, thank you. And it's helpful actually that you've provided these dates to us because I think it contextualizes. As you noted, this is a little bit of an earlier presentation, but I think given the severity of the challenges before us, it makes sense for the board and the broader community to begin to grapple with some of the implications. But as you noted, we'll see closeout funding proposals next month, and either next month or in November, this board will take action on budget guidance. It's traditionally been more in the November timeframe, again, given the somewhat unusual circumstances. And actually what the manager indicated with regard to some of the hiring slowdown, it may be helpful to him to have that guidance a little bit earlier. And so we may, as a board, attempt to give that earlier in October of this year. So wanted to provide that framing. But for now, I think, Mr. Manager, you've provided us with a really specific and clear, if not encouraging, outlook of the revenue picture and some of the expenditure pressure. So questions and comments on that. I think I saw Ms. Garvey go first.
Yeah, thank you. The other issue that's here, I really appreciate the early report because this really is very different. The other issue that you didn't touch on, and I'm thinking maybe not here, but perhaps as we have the public conversation, is about the federal level and the state and local tax reductions. And I asked, and you guys sent a great memo, which I read through, and then I had printed out because I got to read through it again because it's pretty complex. What I got out of it was some of the effects mean that a lot more money will be going down to Richmond. And that the state will be having a bit of a windfall. And I think as we move forward, they're going to be looking at their budget. I think we need to be talking to our residents and also to our legislators because we are kind of getting starved more and more, and they're kind of getting fatter and fatter, and maybe they need to share a little bit more so we can continue to provide provide services without bankrupting our residents. So I think that's part, we don't usually talk about that kind of nexus or that sort of connection, but I think this time we probably need to start doing it early because it's a little complex and help people kind of get their heads around what the new situation is. So I'd just sort of throw that out as a suggestion. I don't know that we want to get into it here. As I say, I know it's fairly complex, but I think it's important for people to understand. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Mr. Vice Chair?
Thank you, Mr. Manager. That was quite the cold water presentation. Let me ask, if you could go back to the community engagement slide for a second. I thought that leading up to this last year, which was, we had to make some tougher budget decisions this past year than we have been used to making for almost a decade. And you, I thought, last year ramped up the community engagement process quite a bit. And I think that those early conversations were quite helpful. And I'm just wondering if, given the fact that our conversation this coming year leading into fiscal 2020 is going to be even more challenging, if you're envisioning any material adjustments to kind of bring home these points with the community, because we're going to really have to make some difficult decisions.
So thank you for that question. Last year we sent out members of my department heads to have host conversations in smaller groups. And we are considering doing that. We also have done something this year that we do every 3 or 4 years, which is we have sent out a survey to county residents, a satisfaction survey. We have done something different, though, for this satisfaction survey. We've added questions about budget priorities. And so we should be getting that information back and hopefully be able to report to the board and the community in October to get a statistically valid sense about what the community's expectations and priorities are. So I think everything that we did last year is still on the table. We haven't refined the schedule on that. We had a lot of conversations and a lot of online opportunities for input. So as you know, Mr. Vice-Stat, I think that the capable CAPE team is sitting back there, one row from the back. I'm sure they will excel beyond what they did last year.
I have every expectation of that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And a great point to make our community primed and aware of those engagement opportunities, because we will be keen to hear from them. Thank you, Mr. Manager. This is the end of the very beginning of what I think will be a long conversation in the months to come.